For a long time, I believed the story of Chernobyl ended the same way most people think it does. There was an explosion, a fire, a rushed evacuation, and then a massive concrete structure built over the remains of the reactor. A tragedy, yes, but one that was ultimately brought under control. That's the version most of us grow up hearing, and for years I never questioned it. But the more I read about what happened after the cameras left and the news cycle moved on, the more I realized something didn't add up. Because when you really look at what unfolded in the months and years after the disaster, it becomes clear that Chernobyl didn't end in 1986. It didn't even really end when the reactor was sealed. What happened at Chernobyl wasn't a single event. It was the beginning of something that is still unfolding today. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion on April 26, 1986, the Soviet Union moved quickly to regain control of the situation. Hundreds of thousands of workers were mobilized in what became one of the largest emergency operations in history. These men, later known as liquidators, were sent in to extinguish fires, clear radioactive debris, and decontaminate the surrounding area. Many of them worked in conditions that would be considered unimaginable today, often with minimal protective equipment and limited understanding of the dangers they were facing. Their task was brutally simple: stabilize the site and seal the reactor. Within months, a massive concrete and steel structure was erected over reactor number 4. It became known as the sarcophagus. The goal was not elegance or permanence, it was speed. The structure was designed to contain radiation and prevent further releases into the environment. And for a while, it seemed to work. Radiation levels outside the immediate zone began to drop. The fires were extinguished. The visible danger faded. To the outside world, Chernobyl appeared to be under control. Even many scientists believed the worst was over. But beneath that concrete shell, something far more complex and far more dangerous was taking shape. The explosion at Chernobyl was unlike anything that had ever happened before in a nuclear facility. When reactor 4 failed, the temperature inside rose so high that nuclear fuel rods melted almost instantly. The uranium fuel mixed with graphite, steel, sand, and concrete. The result was not ash or debris, but a molten, radioactive material that flowed like lava. This substance, later called corium, burned its way downward through the reactor building. It melted through floors. It flowed through pipes. It pooled in rooms beneath the reactor. At the time, engineers assumed it would cool and solidify harmlessly once the fire was extinguished. That assumption turned out to be dangerously optimistic. The corium didn't simply cool and stop. It continued to undergo nuclear decay. It continued to generate heat. And it continued to change. Because it was buried deep inside a destroyed reactor, no one could directly observe it for years. Much of what was happening beneath the structure was inferred rather than measured. And that uncertainty would come back to haunt them. Several years after the disaster, scientists were finally able to send teams into the lower levels of the reactor building to assess the damage more closely. What they found there was something no one had expected. In a dark, flooded corridor beneath the reactor, they discovered a massive, solidified formation of radioactive material. It had a rough, uneven surface and an unnatural shape, as though it had flowed and then frozen mid-motion. Later, it became known as the elephant's foot, due to its wrinkled appearance. Measurements revealed something shocking. The radiation levels near it were so high that a person standing nearby would receive a fatal dose in minutes. Cameras failed, instruments malfunctioned, even brief exposure was dangerous. What alarmed scientists most wasn't just its radiation, it was the realization that this mass represented a large portion of the reactor core itself. In other words, the heart of Chernobyl was still there, not destroyed, not neutralized, just buried, and still active. As studies continued, it became clear that the situation inside the reactor was far more complex than initially believed. The corium was not a stable substance. It contained uranium, plutonium, and other radioactive isotopes that would remain dangerous for thousands of years. It also produced heat through radioactive decay, meaning that even decades later, it was not completely inert. Scientists began to worry about what would happen if water reached the material in large quantities. A buildup of steam or chemical reactions could potentially cause further damage, or at the very least spread contamination deeper into the surrounding environment. At the same time, the original sarcophagus was aging faster than expected. It had been built quickly, under extreme radiation, with limited time for engineering precision. Cracks began to form, rainwater leaked inside, structural supports weakened. By the early 1990s, it was clear that the structure meant to contain Chernobyl was itself becoming a liability. And quietly, behind closed doors, a new reality set in. Chernobyl was not a closed case. The solution was something unprecedented. Instead of trying to dismantle the reactor, a task far too dangerous at the time, engineers decided to entomb it once again, this time inside an even larger structure. The result was the new safe confinement, an enormous steel arch, taller than a football stadium and heavy enough to be the largest movable structure ever built. It was assembled beside the reactor and slowly slid into place over the original sarcophagus. Its purpose was not to fix Chernobyl. Its purpose was to delay the consequences. Inside this massive structure, robotic systems would eventually be used to dismantle what remained of the reactor, piece by piece, over the course of decades. But even today, that process is still ongoing. The danger has not been eliminated. It has only been contained, temporarily. When people think of Chernobyl now, they often think of it as a frozen moment in history, a place abandoned in time, a relic of the Cold War. But the reality is much more complicated. Radioactive contamination remains in the soil and groundwater. Certain areas of the exclusion zone will remain uninhabitable for thousands of years. Wildlife has returned, but studies show genetic abnormalities in some populations. And beneath layers of steel and concrete, the remains of Reactor 4 continue to exist in a state that scientists still monitor carefully. Chernobyl isn't dramatic anymore. There are no explosions, no sirens, no breaking news, just slow, silent decay. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. The story of Chernobyl is often told as a warning about nuclear power, or government secrecy, or human error. But at its core, it's really a story about something else. It's about what happens when a disaster doesn't end cleanly, when the consequences stretch beyond a single generation, when a mistake becomes something that has to be managed, rather than solved. Chernobyl wasn't a moment in time. It was the beginning of a process that is still unfolding beneath layers of concrete and steel. And long after the world stopped paying attention, it continues to remind us of something uncomfortable. Some problems don't disappear. They just wait.